What's up, Hunter?
How are you doing, Joe?
I'm doing good. We were just talking about how crazy some of the people in the past have been. What is it like?
Is that a couple of years ago, I were talking about books. You enjoy these books so much. Why don't we get on some of these professors? And then I went off and I lied to the professors and like doubled or tripled them. And then as a result, they were all, that's great. Because if you're a New York Times bestselling author, you usually have an audience of 3. And so if you have a chance to actually reach a decent number of people, then yeah, you're going to come on this weird podcast. We started getting all of these professors and academics and scientists and all that stuff on. And that's been the journey. And we're now 200 plus episodes in. So there's starting to be an evolution. And part of it is just sort of having actually talked to some of the smartest people in the world. Oh, these are just people. And they know certain ideas that I didn't know. And now I know them. And maybe I can. And even started experimenting with, particularly got really excited. We had a guy called Joe Henrich on who wrote this great book called The Secret of Our Success, which is all about cultural evolution, how cultural evolution works. And one of the things he talks about in there is why do we have black people and why do we have white people? And it comes down to vitamin D and folate and all these. When I first went to college, I wanted to major in linguistics for a while. Really? And what happens is that people naturally in a tribe, and you start to pick up the values and the speech patterns and all that sort of stuff of the tribe. And I really thought of myself as American, in large part because I identified with my mom more than my dad.
It's always interesting to me. There's an added insight that you get from people that come from another country and then live in America. Mm-hmm. There's something different about, oh, you guys don't know how weird this fucking place is. I know. Yeah. I've been to Scotland. I lived there. Those people have a different insight, very different insight. Also, I think we are so established in America insofar as thinking that this is how people live in the world. Like, this is where you go. You go to Burger King, it's right over there. You get on the highway, it's right over here. And we see our landscape and we see our cityscapes and we see it as being normal. But if you don't go to another country, if you don't go, oh, this is normal too. This is normal for them. Oh, this is normal for them.
Yep.
You really need to be there. I don't think that's absorbable from a DVD.
No. And part of it is, I mean, this is a large part of what we've been doing and what Joe Henrich's work is about, is the fact that when you're in a tribe, whatever that tribe is, whether it's America or Christianity or Mormonism or Islam or some Papua New Guineans in the foothills of Papua New Guinea, whatever you do, you're like, that's our way. That's just the way things are done. You don't question it. The tribe creates this sense that this is what normalcy is. And then the second you go outside the tribe, whatever that tribe is, you're suddenly, oh, our tribe is fucking weird. There are other ways of doing things. And that's been a large part of the experience that I had growing up, because the first place that I went after I was born in Saudi Arabia, and then we moved around and we moved to different places. I did Saudi Arabia, Greece, Brazil, England, and then my parents moved to France and Libya and the UAE, and then I came to the US.
Wow.
So moving constantly between tribes, like that was a large part of my experience growing up as a kid, was people are all the same, and yet they're different. And how does that work? And because I come from the background of science, my first response was, oh, well, there must be science of this. Why not go and look at that science and see what the science says about that? Turns out there's a massive amount of science all about it.
Yeah, there's a massive amount of science all about it, and it's so fascinating when you stop and think that there are some people. I'm sure you've seen the most recent photos of that uncontacted tribe in the Amazon really recently over the last couple of weeks.
No.
Oh, it's amazing.
Yeah.
Really cool. I mean, these people, they don't have American T-shirts. Like sometimes you'll see like these tribes, and they're deep in the Amazon, but they have T-shirts on.
They have like a Coca-Cola Adidas. How'd that get there?
There's some interaction. But with these people, there's none. There's been no interaction with the West. They have stick bows that they've made, and they're all barefoot, and they're all wearing leaves and shit. And these people, here they are, trucking along in 2017. And you got to think 50, 60,000 years ago, they probably were living exactly the same way.
Yep. And what's fascinating is just the degree to which those people have so much to teach us, because a lot of what happened at the beginning of the Enlightenment is that if you look at Locke and Rousseau and all of these guys, they're trying to imagine the state of nature. But they're a group of people who are sitting around in Europe. They've never met somebody from the Amazon or someone from Papua New Guinea. And now we really have a pretty good idea of what was life like before civilization.
Yeah.
It's pretty damn fascinating. I mean, Jared Diamond has this great book, The World Until Yesterday, which is literally all about life before civilization and what are the things that we can learn as moderns from these people. What are the things they get right that we get wrong?
What was his examples?
Well, there's a bunch of interesting ones. One of my favorite ones is constructive paranoia. What happens is when you have tribes people and they go outside of their village, they suddenly become massively paranoid, incredibly paranoid. And these people are more paranoid than your average New York Jew. They're suddenly like wandering around the forest. Is this tree going to fall down? Where can we sleep? They go and they check the trees. They look for footprints. Oh my God, are those the footprints of some other tribe? Like, what's going on? What is that sound? What is this paranoia about? And for a long time, he thought this paranoia was just misplaced, that it was inappropriate. But then he had this experience, which was around some other tribe that was potentially trying to kill him in Papua New Guinea. And then the other one was around, he was getting on this boat. And if you're in the West and you get on a boat at the New York Port Authority or whatever, you feel like, oh yeah, this boat's safe. Like there are safety rules. Probably someone would check it, whatever. So he gets on this boat. The boat goes out into the ocean and capsizes and sinks. And he almost drowns to death. And it's because these kids who were running the boat were running it way too fast, and the water kept sloshing over the side in the high waves. And at a certain point, there's so much water in the boat that the boat goes down. When you're in that kind of environment, one of these societies that doesn't have protections and doesn't have rules and all that sort of stuff, being paranoid is super smart. It's the most appropriate thing you can do. And he then talks about how he's a 70, 80-year-old man. I need to be more paranoid because the reality is if I go down, it's probably because I slip in the shower. There are all these things that can actually kill me in my environment that I take for granted because my world seems so safe. One of the things you learn from that is that paranoia is a tool. And rather than a lot of people have trouble with paranoia where they're indiscriminately paranoid. But the key is figuring out what to be paranoid about, when to be paranoid so that you're hyper alert to threats.
Oh, it totally makes sense.
Yeah.
They're very vulnerable. They're so soft and fleshy. Most of their body's exposed, and they're around all sorts of different poisonous things and predatory things, and cats, and spiders, and whatever the hell's out there.
And if you break a leg in the jungle, you're done.
Yeah.
And that's the point, is they don't have the luxury of, oh, I was not paying attention in CrossFit. I dropped a barbell on my foot. Oh, I go to the doctor. I'm out for a few months. Not a big deal.
Yeah, it's a shorter life, though. It doesn't seem like nearly as fun.
Well, the interesting thing is that in many ways that it's actually more fun because they have such a strong part of what we don't have, and obviously part of what you're creating with your podcast and what we're trying to create on a smaller level with our podcast is tribe, like a strong sense of community, a group of people that you belong with, you're in it together, all of that. Mm-hmm. And America, and he particularly talks about the elderly, he talks about what is the experience of the elderly in a tribe, and you're super valuable until death. Everybody respects the shit out of you. You always have things to contribute to a tribe. What do we do with the elderly here? You stick them in a fucking old person's home and leave them to rot. They don't have that sense of belonging, that sense of purpose late in life.
Do you think that's a sheer volume thing? That's almost like we don't value life as much because we're overwhelmed by it.
Part of it is, what are our neurological limits? In general, there's what's called the Dunbar number. Mm-hmm. And the Dunbar number, it's like
150, right?
150. And then there are a series...
But just explain that, what that is for people who haven't heard that.
Yeah, so it's pretty simple. The easiest way to understand it is Facebook. Mm-hmm. You may have 4,000 friends on Facebook, but then you constantly find that, oh, I only really know a few of these people. The majority of them, my brain can't track. And you even get into that experience, like that's what I always find fascinating, is you run into someone you haven't seen in a long time on the street, and you're kind of avoiding the interaction. Because you're
where the fuck do I know this guy from?
Yeah, and you also then, if you really get into it, then you have to dust off the relationship. You have to invest a whole bunch of time.
Yeah.
It's fucking exhausting. So there's a real limit how many people any one human brain can handle. There's a series of Dunbar numbers, and there's essentially 2 or 3 people you would tell anything to. And then there's top 9. Oh, we're cool. We can all go hang out. If I was going to have a bachelor party, these are the people I would invite. And then you get out into larger and larger circles. 150 is the size of a tribe. But then even though there's 150, there's 4,000 people, 5,000 people who you'd recognize their face, but I don't totally fucking know you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a series of all these things. But whatever the numbers are, it's not 7 billion.
It's not even close, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's what's interesting about small towns, is that there's a feeling in small towns of an invasion of your privacy as much as there is a feeling of camaraderie. There's also like a nosiness. If there's 2,000 people living in an apartment building, nobody wants to know shit about anybody. But if it's 2,000 people living in a town, that's the whole town, and everybody needs to know everything about everybody else. But that Hunter boy, you hear what he's up to? And, he's a wacky one. And everybody wants to gossip and exchange information.
And gossip is what Dunbar's work is really about. So his big book is Grooming Gossip and the Origins of Language. Dunbar's whole thesis is the big question has always been, why do we talk? Why do humans have language? What is the function of language? What Dunbar did was he looked at what's the natural group size of different primates. There's a natural group size for apes, for chimpanzees and orangutans and all this sort of stuff. What ends up happening is that if you're chimps, you can groom all the members of your troop. That's not a big problem. But if your troop is 150 people like it is for humans, there's no way you can physically groom all of those people. So it becomes too many people to physically groom. Essentially, the idea is that language is how we groom each other without having to do it physically. And that's what gossip is about. It's really that we're grooming each other, we're maintaining social relationships, and we're trading information about who's trustworthy, who's not trustworthy, who did what to who, and passing information around in the tribe.
It totally makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems also when you think about how women are really into gossiping and chatting, whereas men really appreciate quiet and then get upset if people are too flashy.
Yep.
It's about men going off into hunting parties, right?
Yep.
And the women staying back and going, you know, this crazy motherfucker's doing when no one's looking. And they have to try to assess what the dangers are in their environments.
Yep. And specifically men, like what you're saying about making sure that nobody's getting too flashy, that's the real function of teasing. The real function of teasing is that if you look at these hunter-gatherer tribes, they have all these mechanisms for making sure that nobody's head gets too big. So, for example, they'll do things where I'll give you my arrow and you'll go hunt with my arrow. So then even if you kill a deer, it's actually not your kill because it was done with my arrow.
It's everybody's kill.
It's everybody's kill. And then also when they, for example, they'll have all these rituals when someone is elected the big man of the tribe or whatever it is, they will then all the group will get around and make fun of him and they'll sort of humiliate him. It's proto-democracy. It's a way of keeping his ego in check.
So this is what Donald Trump is avoiding.
Exactly.
This is he's avoiding this inevitable reality of being mocked. That's why he's so mad at Alec Baldwin.
Well, and he should embrace it. I mean, that's the point.
He should, right?
He should, because his social function, the leader's social function, is to be humble. Because power corrupts. That's what it does to human psychology. That's not a function of Donald Trump. That's just a function of the human brain. We know that. That's being studied now. There's a guy at UC Berkeley, Dacher Keltner, who's also awesome, who's studied power. And specifically, there's this old quote from Lord Acton, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. He went and studied that, and he got more specific, and he found out that power does two things. It makes people more impulsive, and it makes them less empathetic. It makes people good impulsive and bad impulsive in the sense that you'll have celebrities who will be like, Wesley Snipes had that great idea of like, I'm just going to not pay taxes.
I think in his defense that he just got one of those wacky attorneys that had him convinced that there's some loophole in the Constitution and they don't want this Constitution loophole exposed. Let me tell you something, man. If they found out that no one has to pay taxes, the government goes down. And there's a lot of people that actually had that conversation with me.
Oh,
they were
really?
telling me that you don't have to pay taxes and that the Constitution says that the only time you're supposed to pay taxes is and it's not legal, and that's why they can't really charge you with it. And if you just resist.
Well, I mean, if you want to talk about the university system, there's a ship that is sinking pretty damn fast. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Yeah.
Isn't it? And that's what you were talking about with power and power corrupting. That is power.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that's going on with this social justice warrior movement is not just people deciding that some people should be more ethical or kind or loving or open or progressive. No. It's exerting power over people to enforce your standard of thinking and behaving on them.
And it's the power of a just cause. Okay, you're fighting. These are things to fight. Like I'm all down with you. But the fact that if you have any problem with it,
and that's like the stupid game that they play.
Exactly.
Like they try to paint you into a corner instantaneously with their opening statement.
Yeah, and if you look at the argument, I think particularly about pronouns, it really comes down to a linguistic one in the sense that words are tools. The big part of Joe Henrich's work is that language simplifies over time. The tools become more and more powerful and more refined. In the same way that, say, a stone tools, you see the early stone tools, they're shit, and then over time they get more and more elegant and more refined. The same thing has been happening with language for the entirety of human history. They get whittled down. What do you think happens if you introduce 70 gender pronouns?
You get equality. You fucking racist, cisgendered piece of shit.
Oh, that's the problem, Joe, is for guys like us, we have so much privilege.
Yep.
We're going to be there checking it in for half an hour, an hour.
Well, we have to even out the world. That's what we have to do. The world must be evened out. So there's no more competition, by the way, which is one of the more hilarious things about people that actually think that they're communist. Just shut your fucking mouth. If you are, and if you really do subscribe to that, I guarantee you're not going contributing. One of those hippies that always wants weed and you never bring some. Come on, man, let's all share. How about you bring your own weed, you fuck? They never have it. And that's the communist people, the people that are really into the idea of communism. Yeah, on theory, about everybody sharing and not worrying about money, that would be great. If there was only the three of us, if we were the only people in the world, this is my example that I always love to use. If there was the three of us and there was $3 million in the world and we all said, well, let's all just split it up and then money won't be nothing. We'll just trade back and forth and everything should be even. Okay, cool. And we'd be fine with that. And then we would go on about our merry way. But there's too many fucking people and there's inevitably going to be some form of competition. And in some form of competition, some people are going to get out ahead. And there's going to be some people that are upset that people are ahead. And there's going to be all sorts of reasons. Some people are going to be ahead because they're assholes. Some people are going to be ahead because they get up at 5 o'clock in the morning while you sleep till fucking noon. That's true too. These are all true. There's some people that are totally ethical and they just do a lot of work and they do better. Yeah. And they're going to do better. They didn't steal from anybody. They didn't rip anybody off. But this narrative keeps getting repeated by people who don't get up at 7 o'clock in the morning or don't have the same kind of ambition or feel bad because some people do want a private jet and fly all over the world and ball like Dan Bilzerian. All these things are true. It's both things. It's like you can be an ethical person and be like a super ambitious, crazy person who wants to succeed in business for some reason. They're not mutually exclusive.
Nope.
So when everybody says capitalism is evil and it's the problem, man. No. You saying that is a problem. It's not a problem. The whole reason why you have a fucking laptop to complain on is because of capitalism.
Right. And the point is that the lesson of 2016 is that there are a lot of shit ideas out there. And there are shit ideas spread all around the political spectrum.
Yeah.
And I think the challenge of 2017 is how do we kill those ideas?
But also in the defense of the people that are anti-corporate or anti-corporation, there is an issue when these gigantic groups get together and their only motivation is acquiring more money every year.
Right.
That does become a problem. And then there's a diffusion of responsibility when you're locked into that giant system and you're just the middle manager of some Exxon group that's fucking killing seals and you don't give a shit. Those poor seals, why are they living in the Arctic anyway? It's where all the oil is. Stupid fucking seals covered up with oil.
Yeah.
It becomes that. It becomes you're just a part of the thing, but look, I got a new BMW, it drives itself. Hey, we got a house in the Hamptons. Everybody's happy. And that's a problem too. So there's two problems. There's a million of them.
Yeah.
But that is a problem with money too. It's like the issue might be corporations in itself might be a problem. That is a power thing. Like you're talking about absolute power.
The problem is not power per se, it's unchecked power.
Right.
And the Founding Fathers understood that. That's why you had checks and balances. And the problem is that a lot of the checks and balances on intellectuals, what's happening at universities, have broken down. And the checks on corporations, which is government, is broken down. And the check on government is the people, and that's broken down. And so what's happened is that a lot of the checks and balances have failed. And the ultimate check and balance is the people. But the problem is that you can't get the wisdom of crowds if the crowd isn't wise.
It's a good statement.
And the problem is that a large part of this is these are large historical forces, namely specialization. So if we get the 300 million people in America, it's not that everybody's an idiot. It's that, oh, you're a lawyer and you know the law. And you know nothing else. Or you are a teacher and you know your subject, you know history, you know whatever. Or if you go into academia and you talk to a bunch of scientists, you'll find, oh, you know your subdiscipline of psychology, of biology, of chemistry, of whatever, and literally nothing else that is happening in science. The problem is that what that happens is if you look at the Founding Fathers, they read really, really widely. I was recently involved in an intellectual dispute with some libertarians, and so I went to libertarianism.org, which is run by the Cato Institute.
What was the intellectual dispute regarding?
The big beef that I've been taking is with fundamentalists. And
across the board.
Across the board. I don't really care what kind of fundamentalist you are. I have an issue with fundamentalism in general. And if you look at what you were just doing, Joe, is that you were able to hold two contradictory thoughts in your mind.
I think it's important, right?
It's incredibly important. You were able to say there's a problem with people who oppose capitalism and there's a problem with much of what corporations are doing. And then that's how you start to figure out reality. Is oh, fuck, there are these two opposing things. How do I reconcile them? And you have to go around, you have to think, you have to read, you have to talk to people, you have to do all that sort of stuff. Fundamentalists aren't burdened with that problem. They have a much easier time because they know that they are the good guys. They know that there is one thing that is the answer to all of our problems and that there is one thing that is bad. And whatever that bad thing is, if we can just get rid of that bad thing, then all of our problems will be solved. And then they go about figuring out how to strip away more and more and more of that bad thing. So you look at the obvious example is Islamic fundamentalism. It's the way of the prophet. We just have to live the way of the prophet Mohammed. And so then we have to strip out anything that interferes with that, like toothbrushes and kites and women's education.
Women driving themselves around.
Exactly. All these really problematic things. And it's not that the Prophet Muhammad didn't have a toothbrush. It was just a stick toothbrush. And I'm not a dentist, but I think that an Oral-B is better than a stick toothbrush.
He had a stick?
They had like sticks that were like bristled at the end or something. Like they would break up the stick and then they just get that stick in there. And,
really?
Yeah.
So you're supposed to use that today, to this day?
If you listen to some imams, yeah.
Wow, if you want to go super, super deep.
Yeah. Well, exactly. That's the point. And it's always about going super, super deep into...
But isn't that the case with Christianity and all religion? There's people that are just casual Christians, just like there's people that are casual Muslims, and then there's people that go whole hog.
That's right.
And think that the reckoning's coming and Jesus is on his way, and
That's
you
right.
better pack your bags because you're going to need clothes in heaven. Like there's people that are packed, ready for Jesus to take them away.
And those people give the rest of Christianity or the rest of Islam a bad name. Wouldn't that be nice if people actually stuck to the statistics, the facts, reality? In terms of cultural evolution, the way that cultural evolution works is we all have certain mindsets. So every human has optimism and pessimism. But for example, we talked about Americans earlier and how outsiders see Americans. And Americans are historically massively optimistic. Even Alexis de Tocqueville, when he came here, right, a French guy comes here, Americans are so optimistic. What is up with that? I mean, honestly, optimism has certain benefits, which is that it makes you super productive, super happy, and these have always been a large part of what American success is about. But optimism does have a problem, which is that optimism has a tendency to make you delusional.
That's a problem.
That's a problem. And so if you look at what is the most optimistic group of humans on the planet, it's actors in Los Angeles.
Are they really the most optimistic, you think?
To move to LA, you have to really believe that out of all the people in the world that somehow you're going to make it. So optimism is what attracts people out here. It's that sort of mindset. And that is where a lot of middle America is right now, because they've had this hope of the American dream, and then those hopes have been crushed. It hasn't delivered. It hasn't panned out the way that it was supposed to. And so you're seeing a lot of pessimism, which is the opposite side. And pessimism has certain strengths. The strengths of pessimism, it's that constructive paranoia we talked about that they practice in Papua New Guinea, which is that you're super alive to threats. But you're actually so alive to threats that you see threats that aren't even there. You're paranoid.
Right.
The dictators are godfathers. That's what they are. Just dictators in general. Who is Gaddafi? Who is Saddam Hussein? Who are any of these guys? They function as the godfather of their societies. And I should clarify, just so that people know, where is this all coming from? This is all coming from books and interviewing academics. And if you are curious about anything, tweet me, let me know. And if there's any comments that you're curious about, I'll direct you to the book and you can go read it and you can work your way up the science chain and figure it out. If you look at those hunter-gatherers, they have two big problems. One big problem is band-level genocide. So what'll happen is that periodically one tribe will just go and wipe the other tribe out. They'll kill them down to the last man. They'll kill the babies. They'll do all that sort of stuff. And this can happen super, super quickly. Jared Diamond, when we had him on the podcast, he told this great story about there's these two tribes in Papua New Guinea. They've been living side by side for years, perfectly happily. They love each other. They get along. They cooperate, all this sort of stuff. And then resources get scarce. There's some change in the environment. Suddenly, there's not as much food around. As people start to get hungry, one of the tribes goes off. In the course of half an hour, they tell each other made-up stories that get increasingly fantastic. And by the end of the half an hour, they have convinced themselves that the other tribe are vermin, that they need to be exterminated, that they are a scourge on the land, that they're not really human, and they go and wipe them out. And that is one of the dangerous potentials in human psychology, is the fact that when resources get scarce, we identify some sort of threat in the environment, some sort of group of humans, and we go and we wipe them out. So if you look at what happened in Germany in 1933, there's the Great Depression, there's hyperinflation, there are all these problems. And that old psychology that hasn't changed in tens of thousands of years is still there. And so naturally, people start looking around for a scapegoat. And the anti-Semitism that is sort of already lingering in the German cultural environment, suddenly that becomes the target group. And Hitler, the political opportunist, comes along and says, oh, you can blame it on them. That's the source of all your problems.
It's almost like there's a death mode locked in the human consciousness that when things get scarce and like, oh, you might die, we're now on death mode.
That's right.
And death mode means you kill other people quickly.
That's right. And you have to understand, I mean, this is the brutal reality of evolution, is that in that hunter-gatherer context, that's useful.
Yeah.
It's really useful if resources get scarce to be the one who acts first, who wipes out the other tribe first.
It's interesting that we even think that this is unusual or bizarre when we look at nature. And when you look at all the different systems in nature that are set up, like how many times lions will kill cubs to make sure that those males don't grow up to dominate them.
That's right.
Especially cubs that aren't theirs.
And that's a big problem of what's happening on college campuses is that there are a lot of unpleasant things in human psychology and unpleasant things in human nature. For humanity, the good things come from being realistic. When we're realistic about how disease works, we get to control it. When we're realistic about how electrons work, we get to control them.
Let me ask you this, because this is really important to this subject. This issue with Marxism spreading across universities. What do you think is the cause of that? Why is that so attractive to people, and why are people so confident to openly proclaim themselves as Marxists without understanding how ridiculous that is?
John Haidt, who is at NYU, he has what's called moral foundations theory. We all have basic impulses of morality. So, for example, fairness. You can watch little kids and they're tracking fairness. What's fair? Who got more? Who got to play with the toy more and all that sort of stuff. That doesn't change, but we have these notions of fairness play out in different ways as we're adults. Different political groups and different tribes favor these other notions of fairness more than some others. So take, for example, the issue of pro-life versus pro-choice. Are all humans hypocrites, or is it that we selectively use these same intuitions that we all have for different causes? So we all have these same intuitions, but we use them in different ways to justify our political arguments.
Well, what's interesting, too, is that there's two positions that are taking place in the American psyche, at least, that we're almost reluctantly agreeing to. And it's that the Republicans are, or the conservatives, are more realistic, more hardcore, ready to kick ass, ready to fight for what's right.
Yeah.
Whereas the liberals are a bunch of whiny crybabies looking to give away their money, and they're creating welfare babies. If it wasn't for the conservatives, these people would be speaking German and living in Vietnam.
Exactly. The nature of all tribes is you tell something that makes your tribe look like the good guys.
Right.
Each tribe that's the conservative story. The problem is that what ends up happening is that when you have an echo chamber like college campuses, which are incredibly liberal with very few outside opinions, that's the rabbit hole that they go down. They go down the caring rabbit hole. And when you go down the caring rabbit hole, you end up at Marxism. When you're surrounded by people who think like you, there's no one to sit you down and be, that's fucking nuts. Let's talk about...
Why do you think that is? Why do you think going down the caring rabbit hole leads you to Marxism?
Because you don't want anyone's feelings to get hurt. You want everybody to have enough. You want to share. And it's important to realize, back to your point where you said if it was the three of us, communism might work. It comes back to the Dunbar number. If you actually look at hunter-gatherer tribes, they're communists. They're really, really socialist. What they do is they have these behaviors where, for example, they'll drag, if you go and kill a deer, we drag it into the middle of the village so everybody can see the deer, and then we divide it up, and then you make sure that you give it to everybody else first, and then you take the last piece and you take the smallest piece. So it's what you do with birthday cake. You're trying to show everybody, I'm being super sherry here. Isn't this great? I'm not thinking about myself. And at the level of a tribe, you and I can track all of the interactions. We can track the fact that over there is not pulling his weight. We go out hunting all day, and then you sit around and to get to pull his weight.
So, but Marxism being a communist ideology.
Yeah.
Marxism being that everyone should be more equal, sharing more. That doesn't really work.
It doesn't work at 7 billion people or 300 million people.
Might work at 50.
It works at 50 or 150 because that's what our brain can track.
Right.
The problem is that I can't track all the
It works great without technology. It works great without access to people all over the world. It works great in a consolidated environment, a small, controlled, contained environment.
Yep. But it doesn't work when you're in an apartment building of 2,000 people and you don't want to fucking talk to anybody.
What if people say, well, it should work and we can make it work? It's just this old, outdated mindset that you fuckers you guys grew up way back in the day before the influence of the internet. Now we understand that Z is a very respectable pronoun and we need to be using XIR. How do you say that? Zir?
I think so. I don't know.
The other 75 options or whatever they are, you nutty cunts. Oxford's making people use it.
Oxford has also gone down the rabbit hole, but these colleges and academia are not going to go back out of the rabbit hole. They're just keep going down the rabbit hole until the larger community holds them accountable.
So do you think that that's happening at all now? I mean, there was the president of Chicago University that said, hey, listen, there's not going to be any safe spaces this year. There's not going to be any trigger warnings. Just shut the fuck up and go to work and learn. This is the marketplace of ideas.
That's right.
Express yourself. Get your ideas challenged. Debate these ideas. Let's find out what's right rather than what's safe.
And I think a large part of how you do that faster, firstly, people are already doing it. There's the guy at Chicago, there's Jordan Peterson. The larger community is having a conversation about this. But the faster way to do this is science. You confront people with science, and then you force people to either accepting reality or you denying reality. And if you're denying reality, then you got a real problem because now you look like a fool.
When you talk about science, you run into a real issue when it comes to gender. Gender in science, gender as is discussed on campuses today, things get real weird. It gets real loose and open to interpretation, and even though you're biologically a male, you can identify as a woman, and the correct way to treat you is to treat you as a woman. So we're gone. We're outside the realm of science now.
Well,
and we're into the world of social constructs and agreed upon behavior.
The science exists. It's just in journals, and it hasn't been brought and made accessible to these children. And there are ways to do it very simply. So, for example, do you know the story of David Rymer?
No.
Okay, so this was a kid in the 60s who I think he was Canadian. And for some bizarre reason at the hospital, the surgeon decides to use an electrocautery needle to circumcise him. And there's a huge botch up, and he manages to chop off most of his dick. And so the parents are like, okay, can't put that back on. What do we do? They end up going to the world's leading specialist in the 1960s or whatever it was, 50s, 60s, on gender identity and all this stuff, which is this guy, Dr. Money. Go and see Dr. Money. Dr. Money convinces them to castrate their penisless son to raise him as a girl. They have to go take their son in. David, who is now going to be raised as Brenda, Dr. Money is showing pictures of naked men to Brenda and saying, this is what girls like and all this sort of stuff, is forcing him to wear women's clothing, and they're going to do hormone therapy and all this sort of stuff. Dr. Money is meanwhile publishing papers that is saying, oh, this is a tremendous success. It's amazing. Like gender is all a construct, blah, 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 perfectly adjusting to life as a girl. And the plan is that they're going to do surgery and give him a vagina and all this sort of stuff. Meanwhile, what is Brenda doing? Brenda's hitting things with sticks. Brenda has no interest in playing with her sewing machine, except for the one time that she takes a screwdriver and picks it apart to figure out how it works. Doesn't want to hang out with girls, only wants to hang out with boys, only wants to play with her brother's toys. So all these sorts of things. And at some point, when the kid is like 13, 14, the jig is up. They figure out that they better tell Brenda the truth. Brenda finds out the truth and proceeds to have a mastectomy to remove her breasts, switches to male hormones, and instantly goes to living as a boy. What happens is Brenda, now David, grows up, marries a woman, has a relationship, but unsurprisingly has a whole bunch of psychological issues and ultimately goes into a supermarket parking lot and blows his brains out. Now, the point is that I think that if you really want to talk about gender, you should force anybody who wants to deny gender to talk about David Rymer. You make David Rymer a household name. And we're all going to talk about what lessons can we learn from the tragedy of David Rymer. And if you get your tens of millions of listeners, 30 million plus listeners, talking about David Rymer, and you're going to make David Rymer a household name, you're going to make sure that the tragedy of David Rymer is something that everybody knows about and learns about, and that everybody's tweeting and talking about David Rymer, then suddenly it becomes very hard for anybody to say that gender is purely a construct. There may be spectrums and there may be weird in-between areas, but the reality is that a lot of gender is genetic, and the science is there, and you're not going to get a bunch of social justice warriors to read science because most people don't actually read science, but you will get them to engage with the story of David/Brenda Rymer.
There's most certainly is a spectrum, but there's also a high percentage of people that operate in a very specific area of that spectrum. And you're going to get some kids that are convinced that they are boys.
That's right.
But guess what? Some of those kids grow up and they change their mind as they get older. And that's something that really disturbs the shit out of me when I see 9-year-olds that are on hormones. This seems crazy. If this kid really thinks he's a girl, let him think he's a girl as is. Why are you adding hormones to the mix? Why are you suggesting surgery when he turns 15 or whatever the fuck the age is? Like, this seems like something that should be worked out by a grown adult with a fully developed frontal cortex.
In general, reality denial leads to tragedy. What we have to be engaged with is, what is reality? It's not that I sit here and have read literally all of the science. I can't. It's far too vast a project, and science isn't supposed to be an individual project. It's supposed to be a collective project where we're all trying to figure out what is this known as reality that has evaded us for millions of years, or tens, hundreds of thousands of years. The point is that if you want to talk about gender, for example, let's talk about people who are intersex. There are some people who are born and their genitalia at birth aren't clearly male or female. And what the medical community is that you basically find out what are they genetically, are they XY or are they XX, and then you raise them as that. But you don't do hormones and you don't do surgery precisely because you're going to let them decide. And if you are, how much better? Okay, so why is this surgeon using an electrocautery needle to do circumcision? Who the fuck knows? Like, it's a dumb choice by a surgeon. But imagine if they'd said, okay, that fuck up happened. We can't unfuck that up. But we're not going to now make it worse by chopping off his balls. If you really care about children and you really care about people, which is the sort of the big liberal value, then the Hippocratic Oath, the whole point of being a doctor is their first responsibility is do no harm. You're not supposed to make things worse. If you can make things better without possibly making things worse, then that's great. We don't let children vote. We don't let children drive. Why would we let them make such a huge decision at such a young age? Intelligent answers and intelligent solutions can emerge from just competing forces. All of these cultures are well adapted to a particular environment. We talked about American culture and we talked about Russian culture. Russian culture selects for pessimism. American culture, because you had to move all the way across the ocean, if you've got villages in Italy, Vietnam, whatever it is, who is the person in that village who says, I'm going to go across the ocean to a country I know nothing about and make a fortune? It's the most optimistic individual. And so it's a magnet for all the most optimistic individuals in the world. The analogy I always use is, do you ever see American Tail? The old animated movie from must be the 90s or whatever. That's it.
No, I don't think I saw that.
Oh, Steven Spielberg. Well, anyway, it's about the immigrant experience more generally, and then specifically about the Russian Jewish experience. It's about this family, the Mouskovitzes. And right there on that trunk, there's Fievel Mouskowitz. And Fievel Mouskowitz, in the first part, they're in Russia, and they're all being persecuted by cats because they're mice. And Fievel Mouskowitz sings a song with all of the other Mouskowitzes called There Are No Cats in America, which is so much of what the American immigrant experience is about. Oh, it's all going to be perfect, land of opportunity, the streets are paved with gold, except in an American Tale, the streets are paved with cheese.
American T-A-L.
Yeah, exactly.
E or T-A-I-L?
T-A-I-L.
Tail, like rat
right,
tail.
Exactly.
Okay, mouse tail.
These different environments, just as you have different environments select for different beaks or wings or whatever it is, select for different mindsets, different ways of thinking, different cultural traits. And what ends up happening is that we become well adapted to a particular environment. What happens to the point of the Lost City of Z is what happened to all of these European explorers who went into the Amazon. A lot of them died. And that's because they're doing things that are well suited to England, like walking around in wool suits and eating cans of chipped beef. But suddenly when you're in the 100-degree heat of the Amazon and there's all these animals you don't understand and you don't know how to use the plants that you squeeze and have the anesthetic in them and all that sort of stuff, you can't survive. And what they called in the Lost City of Z, all the explorers, they called it the Amazon a counterfeit paradise. It looked like a paradise. It was so lush, it was so tropical, but there's nothing to eat. Except clearly there was, because Amazonian people had been living there for tens of thousands of years. The Westerners didn't have the cultural software that was well suited to surviving in that environment. There's another strategy that is used that evolved, and that earlier strategy is being a crazy motherfucker. You establish a reputation as the kind of guy that you don't fuck with. You come on my land, I kill you. You touch my sheep or my women, I kill you. And I use such an aggressive level of violence that you know that there is no point in fucking with, let's imagine, a much tougher person. Conor McGregor, for example, is a great example. You don't fuck with Conor McGregor. He has a reputation as just being a badass motherfucker who will fuck you up.
Right. So that's how you keep people off your land.
That's right. And if you look at a couple of herder cultures, so herder cultures include the Scots-Irish, who are the rednecks. Herder cultures include the Mongolians, the Mongols, notoriously a very gentle, peace-loving people, right? And they include the Bedouins, who are the Arabs, who had camels and all of that sort of stuff. And you'll notice that there is that same use of violence. And mostly they fight amongst themselves. There's this interclan warfare. But periodically a charismatic figure emerges who unites the clans. Genghis Khan manages to to unite the Mongols. And then what do the Mongols proceed to do? They proceed to go use that aggressive use of violence. They have those horses which allow them to move quickly, and they're really effective, and they go and they fuck everybody up. Because the gentle farmers of China aren't prepared for that, and the gentle farmers of Persia aren't prepared for that. What happens with the Arabs? The Arabs are mostly fighting amongst themselves. But then along comes this charismatic figure with a new belief system that unites them, Mohammad. And he unites them, and suddenly they fuck everybody up, and they create this great empire, the Caliphate, that spreads all across Central Asia and the Middle East and all across North Africa. And in many ways, that is what Donald Trump is. The rednecks have been fighting amongst themselves for a long time, and then Donald Trump, the Genghis Khan of America, the Mohammed of America, has succeeded in uniting the clans. In our time, you don't do it by going out and raping and pillaging. You go and you seize the ballot box, and you vote, and you take back power. And so that's what they've done. In general, one of the great destructive forces in human history is the British map maker. You know what I mean? Europeans just love a straight line. Yeah. They just can't get enough of the straight line. The straight line works in Middle America because you've already wiped out all the tribes, but it doesn't work so well in Africa where there are still tribes, or Southeast Asia where you suddenly start drawing a line between two tribal groups or across a tribal group, and suddenly now shit's all fucked up. And what they're trying to do when they're having all these civil wars is they're trying to unfuck the boundaries.
Straight lines are annoying.
Yeah, they are.
You know, it's really hilarious when you get busted for transporting something across state lines. Like, am I allowed to drive around with this or not? What's the law? Like, if you have pot in particular, I mean, you cross a state line, you go from being someone who is innocent 100% to someone who's guilty 100% of a felony. Yeah, it's so bizarre. Like testing out with Colorado and legal marijuana. Again, it worked out. That's out great. And people went, look, this is working. It's profitable. It helps everybody. Let's go. And then it's sold the idea to other people.
That's right.
And then there's other places like open carry. And you're like, hey, are you sure? You sure concealed carry? Okay, you could just have a gun on you everywhere you go. You go to the movie theater? Okay.
But where are the places where that's true? And that's because it comes down to what this is being driven by. It's being driven by old cultural baggage that doesn't necessarily make sense. So there's really, in terms of honor cultures, there are 4 books that I think that if you want to go into this, don't get angry at me, just read the 4 books.
What are those books?
Those books are Black Rednecks, White Liberals, Thomas Sowell's book, A Culture of Honor, which is Richard Nisbet's book, J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy, and then a book called The Short and Tragic Life of Robert Peace. And if you read those 4 books and you're still saying that what I'm saying is unsubstantiated, then we should talk about it.
Well, aren't there a lot of liberals that are up in arms when you propose these things?
Of
Especially
course.
when you start bringing up the herder culture. No, what about the patriarchy? What about white racism?
Exactly.
What about, you can't be racist towards white people. That's one of my favorite things that people are saying today.
What, that you can't be racist to white people? Yeah. There's a lot of favorite things to say. People are saying a lot of weird and wacky shit.
But that's one of the wackiest. Like, of course you can.
Yeah.
Like, that's... Racism only works when someone has power. Well, when you're racist to someone, you have power over it, period. Well, like cultural power, like what? Presumed across the board?
Yep.
Like black and white? Like real simple, yes or no? Binary, 1 or a 0? Is that what we're doing?
Yep.
Is that people? Of course not.
No, of course not.
Of course not. Of course you could be racist. You could judge someone prejudiciously. It's in many ways bad to not talk about this. So like
that is correct.
People that have the issue with even discussing the origins of certain types of behavior and comparing, and it opens up this weird can of worms where people are not willing to discuss it openly. It's taboo.
We know the Siberian candidate. What's the...
Is there a Siberian candidate?
Well, people are saying Donald Trump is the Siberian candidate because Putin installed him.
Yeah, what do you think about this whole situation with Russia today? Because it seems like that poor country doesn't know how to get rid of that one guy who's their main dude, as much as Gary Kasparov talks about.
It is a very weird time.
It's so crazy to think that we're in a Cold War again. Like, how did we duck that forever? Like, through the whole Clinton administration, that was a non-issue. Through the entire Bush administration, non-issue. Through the entire Obama administration, non-issue until 2012-ish. And then you started hearing about it again.
A large part of what's happened is that our environment has changed, but our culture has not. If you look at, in the 1950s, if you're talking about the marketplace of ideas, you had these guys like Edward R. Murrow and Walter Cronkite, and they had a thing called journalistic integrity.
My friend Mike Swick who was a former UFC fighter, worked in Russia with the American Secret Service a long time ago, and he said that they had found these listening devices hidden inside buildings that were powered by the movement of the building during the wind. Like, what?
Yeah.
They have their own power source, is literally the building moving in the wind was, he said it was so far beyond anything that the Americans had figured out at the time, and they were just all about surveillance.
Well, that was the things that the Soviet Union did well. There were a few things that the Soviet Union really put their attention on, like space and surveillance and espionage and all that sort of stuff, and the military, and they did those very well.
We've always known that intelligence agencies will distribute propaganda. We know that. That's 100% factual.
And that's the problem in general, is that you know that the CIA engages in that sort of behavior.
Of course.
You know that the FSB, the Russian security service, engages in that behavior.
Of course.
Who do you trust?
Who do you trust?
And that's the basic problem of 2017, 2016.
100%.
Who the fuck do you trust?
So you got to know that if someone from any agency is telling you something, what would it serve them to tell you 100% the truth without any manipulation whatsoever in order to gain favor, in order to gain influence? Would the CIA have any motivation to be 100% accurate about it? Why?
The CIA, obviously, Donald Trump is not clearly a friend to the CIA. He's already made it clear that he has issues with the intelligence community. And he hasn't been briefed by them, and he's been rejecting that. That's the point. We live in the old Chinese curse. We live in interesting times. But it's good for Putin, because what does the Godfather want? I think it's important to understand the disaster of American foreign policy. What is that about? And it's because modern Americans have grown up in the most successful, most productive, most stable country in history. As many generations into democracy as you are, there's not a real understanding of how you get to democracy. We just inherited democracy, and we're like, well, I don't know how you make one. And then you get these ridiculous fables that Americans have about themselves, where they think that King George III was this awful, vicious dictator, and then we kick the dictator out, and then democracy. And so that's all you have to do, is you have to go in and you have to remove dictators. And if we just keep removing dictators, then democracy will emerge. Well, what happens when you remove Saddam Hussein?
Vacuum.
Yeah.
Fills up with
ISIS. Isn't that delicious? Or you remove Gaddafi. What happens?
Vacuum.
Yeah. And then what happens?
ISIS.
Al-Qaeda, all these sorts of things. So the big question that has always been in political science, and that Francis Fukuyama frames, is why is it that the American Revolution succeeded and the French Revolution descended into bloody violence? And the answer is that they were actually at two different stages of development.
But it is the blaming of understanding the root of the behavior as being cultural, and that we have these ideologies that we become imprisoned to, these patterns of behavior that we become imprisoned to, and that we're all subject to it. Anyone with an accent understands that this is where it comes from, that we imitate behavior that it's around us. And if we're around an area, like we were talking about the Middle East, with poor resources and with scarcity and a lot of violence, this is the type of behavior that we're going to control our women, dress them up, cover them up like beekeepers. We got to keep them away from the other swinging dicks. Fucking assholes that are going to come over the hill with the swords and the horses, because that's what's been going on forever.
Exactly.
I mean, if you look at Iraq, one of the craziest stories about Iraq was Iraq's Baghdad being invaded by the Mongols and then killing everybody and running the streets red with blood and black with ink, and the rivers would be filled with the philosophy and all the writings from all of these Islamic theorists and all these different scholars who were far ahead of that aspect, the rest of that part of the world at the time. So much mathematics, so much philosophies, so much knowledge came from that part of the world. It was totally lost when they were invaded.
And so much of it is that there's an old quote that floats around, which is that if Nobel Prizes had been given out in the year 1000, they all would have gone to Arabs.
Amazing, isn't it?
They were at the forefront, and the point is that tells you something, which is that success is not a permanent condition, right? Cultures can gain it, and cultures can lose it, and you better figure out what is it that makes a culture successful so you can preserve those values, fight for those values, instill them, spread them, all that sort of stuff.
And that's why Putin is jockeying for power, because he believes that there's a turnover going on right now, and they just hired a fucking reality star to run the biggest nuclear arsenal the world has ever known. Holy shit, this might be the time.
Yep. And the instability that has been created is that you gave everyone a microphone. That's what the internet is. We're literally sitting here. You can start a show, and if people resonate with the show, great. And the point is that there are some people like you who can hold two contradictory ideas in their head, and you can wrestle with that. Man, how do I make sense of both of these things? That capitalism fundamentally generates wealth and prosperity and all that sort of stuff, but corporations can do fucked up things. How do I reconcile those two different things? And then there's a whole bunch of people out there on the internet who are fundamentalists or who offer some sort of very, very simple narrative that is very easy for people to get. And people can go down the rabbit hole of their prejudices. They can go down the rabbit hole of caring and compassion, and they end up at Marxism. Or people can go down the libertarian rabbit hole of freedom. And so they come up with this idea called anarcho-capitalism. And anarcho-capitalism is the idea that we're just going to remove all government, and then the free market will solve all problems. So there's literally going to be minimal or no government. I got in a big fight over the Christmas holidays with a group of anarcho-capitalists. We interviewed Peter Schiff, and Peter Schiff is a libertarian. And part of the experience of doing this podcast with Bryan Callen is we interviewed all these academics, 206 of them. And then at episode 206, there were two things that we noticed. A, there were all these amazing ideas. B, you would find that any academic knew about his amazing idea and nobody else's. Like they didn't know about anything else that was going on in science or anything like that. That's what academics are like. And it actually comes out of sort of what the Western cultural bias is, which is towards this thing called atomism. Scientists are super focused on a tiny, tiny question. They don't look for the bigger picture. We reach this frustration where these ideas, there's an old George Bernhard Shaw joke about economists. He said all the economists laid end to end would never reach a conclusion. And it's the same thing with academics. All the academics laid end to end would never reach a conclusion. There's all this science that piles up, all this sort of stuff. What does it mean? What should we do? How should we live our lives? How do we solve the problems of people in the ghettos? How do we solve the problems of the people in the Middle East? How do we make liberals have some sort of perspective? How do we do these things? And the science should turn into practical things. And in some areas it does. Physics has this adjacent profession, engineering. And engineers go and they look at the laws of physics and they figure out how to engineer quantum computers and all this other stuff. But when you talk about the human sciences, the adjacent profession that's supposed to be there is storytelling. There's what's called the science to narrative chain, where you're supposed to take science, all of this research, and supposed to turn it into simple stories that people can understand and get. And there is, in fact, just to give you a sense of this problem, everybody knows that scientists aren't the best communicators. The ones that are, you get on this show. Because, man, scientists who can communicate like a human. The ones that are, Carl Sagan, these people are unicorns. They're very, very rare in the scientific community. My very specific experience, when I graduated from college, I started tutoring just to pay my bills. But I was really trying to figure out, I had this weird experience where I would be working with kids and I would hear them say things like, oh, I didn't get the math gene. What is that? Math gene? Because I was a biochemistry major. You're 13 and failing biology and you're telling me that you have a math gene and I just majored in biochemistry and we don't know about any math gene over there. So what are you talking about?
Someone's telling them that.
Somehow they're picking that
and
up.
And they're getting this idea.
That's right.
Limited potential.
That's right. That was a detective hunt that I went on because there's a lot of these things. I don't have a natural ear for languages. That's another big one we heard. And, oh, I'm not a natural writer and all of these sorts of things. What are all these beliefs? And I could tell that they were problematic and that they were self-defeating. And specifically, having moved between all of these cultures, I'd seen that different cultures have very different ideas about intelligence, but especially my mother and my father side by side on the issue of learning languages. My dad is Dutch. When you're Dutch, you grow up with one great certainty in life, which is that no one will ever learn Dutch. So if you want to get a job and you want to be competitive, you better learn everybody else's language. It's routine in Holland to speak 3-4 languages. And my dad spoke 10. He studied 10 different languages in his life. Anybody who comes from a lot of these minority languages, smaller languages, you find they do this. Poles routinely learn a lot of languages. People from Southeast Asia routinely learn a lot of languages. And it's that environment. You lost the language lottery, and so you better make up for it. You're just going to have to do that. And at a certain point, when you've learned 3 or 4 languages, suss this thing out. Oh, I get how this works. This is just about work, and there are certain techniques and certain approaches. You start to get really, really good at it. I really, from my dad, picked up this love of learning languages. And my dad is especially into languages. He didn't really like school, and every time they would tell him he had to take another subject, he would look up another language to take. So, for example, he ended up taking Swedish because in the 60s and 70s, all the pornos were made in Swedish. And he wanted to know what they were saying between sexual thrusts, right?
Oh, that's hilarious.
So he learns Swedish, he learns all these weird languages because you need me to take another class, I'm going to do something that I enjoy.
You're calling Richard Dawkins a Scientologist.
Yeah, you've now gotten a taste of some of the things that are going on across science. There's lots of really exciting stuff that can actually change and improve and help people's lives.
But one of the things that I think that you pointed out that's incredibly critical is that in order to be at the top of your field, you must be completely absorbed in that particular subject. And oftentimes, a lot like all the other systems that we find, they have limited resources, and you really don't have the time or the energy or even the inclination to study all these other comparable systems or different disciplines, or there's many examples of that. But singular focus is what usually leads to greatness. And when you're reading about some professor's peer-reviewed work that's incredibly groundbreaking, oftentimes you're dealing with a form of greatness, and that requires massive tunnel vision.
So we should talk about what tunnel vision is. Just as we have optimism and pessimism, there are these other two mindsets, atomism and holism. And atomism is seeing the tree. You ignore the forest and you're just, I'm going to look at that one tree and become the world's expert in that. And then there's holism, which is seeing the big picture, seeing the forest, seeing all of that sort of stuff. Everybody has these mindsets. Different cultures favor them differently because of the environmental pressures of that environment. The Greeks massively favored atomism. And if you look at the behavior of the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, they were constantly picking everything apart because they were pirates, right? They were pirates and traders and fishermen. And in that environment, it's not about cooperation or anything like that. It's about everybody just trying to get ahead for themselves and all that sort of stuff. Very individualistic. And so when they would have leisure time, what were the things they did? They would go into the marketplace and they would argue with each other and pick apart each other's arguments. And that's what logic is and rhetoric and all of that sort of stuff. And then they would also, when they had other leisure time, they would go and see who could throw shit furthest, who could run fastest. It's all about standing out. It's all about trying to excel and be the best. And what happened is that during the Renaissance, the rebirth, they were obsessed with the Greeks. The Romans were obsessed with the Greeks. And then when the rebirth, the Renaissance happened, they were obsessed with the Romans and the Greeks. And so they became obsessed with this culture. And that's how you start to get this culture of individualism that develops. The founding fathers were obsessed with that. And so that becomes a lot of the spirit of the West, this real atomistic culture. Meanwhile, over in Asia, they have different incentives, which is rice farming. And so what happens is that rice farming is you have to be super cooperative because the water runs down the mountain, it runs through my paddy field, but then it runs through your neighbor's paddy field and all that sort of stuff. So I have to have relations with my neighbor, and then I have to think about how it affects the next guy and the next guy and the next guy and the next guy. So they favor holism. How does everything fit together? And so if you look at what is Eastern culture about, what are those ancient Asian cultures about, it's all about yin and yang, things fitting together and complementing it, all being part of a larger system. And Confucianism was all about the family and relationships, and everybody has their proper role, and you all have to belong and all of that stuff. Which set of biases do you think that science has baked into its culture?
Atomism.
Yeah. And so when you get the structure of scientific culture as it stands today, it's super atomistic. If you look at things like economics and psychology and biology and all of these sorts of things, they're all studying the natural world. And in fact, there's a whole bunch of disciplines that are all studying humans and how they behave and all of that stuff. And yet they're all broken up into separate disciplines. And now they're sort of doubling down on those intuitions, and they're now breaking up those disciplines into sub-disciplines and smaller disciplines and smaller disciplines. And left to their own devices, they'll just keep splitting up and getting smaller and smaller. As you get smaller and smaller and smaller disciplines, it doesn't necessarily make the science better. It can make the science worse. And the reason why it makes the science worse, the easiest way to understand it is the story of the blind men and the elephant. So this is an old story from India about religion. A group of blind men come along and they decide to figure out what this thing is. They don't know it's an elephant. So the first one comes up and he feels the tail and he feels the end of it and he feels the little hairs at the end and he says, "It's a rope!" And the second one goes along and he feels the trunk and it rides in his hands and he jumps back startled and he's like, "It's a snake!" And the third one feels the leg, he thinks it's a column. The fourth one feels the side, he thinks it's a wall. And then the fifth one feels the ear and decides that it's a palm leaf. And then they all proceed to beat the shit out of each other because clearly everybody else is an idiot and they need to die because they know that it's a rope, it's a snake, it's a leg, it's a wall, it's a column, whatever it is. If you look at something like feminism, Feminism is making certain claims about biology, making claims about how male gender works, how female gender works. They should be looking at things like genetics, and they should be looking at chromosomes, and they should be looking at evolution to see how evolution might have selected for differences in men and women because there are different competing pressures for men and women. And in fact, if you go into actual science, you'll find that there's actually lots of science about that. What's happened is that feminism has become its own tribe. And as a tribe, it rejects the findings of other tribes. If I go into the circles of feminism or sociology or any other tribe, and I start talking about the evidence of some other tribe, they're like, oh, that doesn't count. It's easy to rationalize it away. So now we're no longer grounded in reality. What we can do is we can take that tail and we can convince ourselves that it's a rope because we're not accountable to all of these other fields that's surrounding it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
If you want to solve the problem, what you have to do is that you have to make each discipline accountable to all the other disciplines. You have to make people responsive to evidence outside of their field. If you take someone like Richard Dawkins, has Richard Dawkins gone down his particular rabbit hole of figuring out his tiny piece of the world? Yes, he has done that.
And what makes you think that?
I can tell you. So in general, what you're going to find is that there's, in a lot of different fields, you're going to find that there are two competing theories right now. For example, if you look in economics, there's this idea, there's what are called classical economics, and they have this idea called rational agent theory. And they think it's a reasonable approximation to assume that people are rational, that they act as rational individuals. And then, meanwhile, there's another school called behavioral economics. And because of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who were these two Israeli psychologists in the 1970s who started to study human rationality, what they found is that humans aren't that rational. There was a group of economists who say, hey, our whole discipline is based on this idea of rational agent theory, but when we look at psychology, that assumption doesn't check out, and it leads to a whole bunch of bad conclusions. So they formed a new school of economics called behavioral economics, which is based on all the findings of psychology, how humans actually think, and all of that sort of stuff. Now, these two schools are warring. They're two fighting tribes. What ends up happening is that they can't solve that discipline. They can't solve that in the context of academia. They fire papers back and forth. Lots of discussions are had and all that sort of stuff. You have a recurring problem in science, which is that scientists won't let go of their pet theories. They won't let their theories die. Max Planck, the physicist, had this famous quote that he said, "Science proceeds one funeral at a time." What happens is that science doesn't progress because people are like, hey, new evidence came out. Turns out I was wrong. Now I'm going to change my mind because it's their theory. And so they keep on fighting for and defending their theory until they're dead. And then the discipline is, oh, okay, now that that guy's dead, obviously that was dumb all along. Let's move forward.
Interesting. So ego becomes this sort of trap.
Huge problem for science in general. If you look at, for example, that rational agent theory dispute, one of the big founders of behavioral economics, this guy, Richard Thaler, he tells a great story. And the story is that he's at a dinner party. And at this dinner party, there's this famous economist from the whole rational agent theory camp. There's also like a bunch of other academics, like a psychologist. The guy who believes in rational agent theory is going on and on about how dumb people are. And so the psychologist pipes up and says, how come all the people in your theories are geniuses, but all the people you know in real life are idiots? And that's a real problem for your theory because your observations about reality do not fit your theory. But what does this guy do? Does this guy say, you know what? I'm going to fall on my sword. I'm going to throw out 30, 40 years of work on a bad idea. No, he's not going to say that. Instead, what he does is he does what Richard Thaler calls the invisible hand wave, where he proceeds to wave his hand and say, well, you know, there might be some irrationality, blah, 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 blah. But in the end, markets sort things out. He's rationalizing. Scientists rationalize. Humans rationalize. They want to defend their own most cherished ideas. This is not a problem of Richard Dawkins. This is a problem of humans. And if humans have power, and intellectual power is a form of power, and it's not checked, they will continue to rationalize their bad ideas. The intellectual dispute is this. In the 1960s, there was this idea of group selection, but it was very fuzzy and it was a shitty version of group selection, which is the idea that natural selection happens not only at the level of genes, but also at the level of human groups, and the idea that selection is happening at many, many, many levels. Dawkins in 1976 writes this big, important book, The Selfish Gene. And it's that you actually don't need group selection to make sense of a lot of behavior. You can just use what's called kin selection. For example, you might do something nice for your sister, or you might potentially die to save your sister, but we can make sense of that at the level of genes because your sister shares many of the same genes, so you don't need this idea that groups matter. What the problem is that some people read that and they concluded that what that means is that the way to get ahead is to be selfish. And you'll hear in business circles, you'll hear this idea of, oh, it's all about law of the jungle, kill or be killed. That's how you get ahead, survival of the fittest.
So it's confirmation bias. They're looking for something to confirm their ideas about competing in business.
And that's what Skilling probably wanted to believe. And so he read Dawkins' book and, now I have intellectual credibility for what I wanted to do anyway. What should happen, I think, in terms of our economy not blowing up, in terms of corporations not engaging that sort of toxic behavior, is that I don't have the authority because I'm a nobody. So I can't come out and say, this is what science is. In fact, there is literally no human alive today that can come out and say what science is, because people can only come out and speak about their tiny field. There's no consistent message from science. It's constantly changing, and now, especially because the environment is changing so fast because of technology and all these sorts of things, we need to change the culture fast, and we need to change the culture intentionally.
So who decides how the culture gets changed? Is it Donald Trump or is it Hunter Maats?
And it's not either of us. It should be the group. And the point is to spark a conversation so that we can have this conversation. But the point is that there are certain academics who are going to try and stand in the way of that conversation and will use their authority to try and shut down that conversation because they're trying to defend their pet theory in whatever discipline it is. The basic problem is that there's a lot of science that is really useful, but one man can't figure it all out.
You can't hold on to a theory.
No.
You have to expose it to the marketplace of ideas. It has to be tested.
What I can do, because a lot of this comes down to what's permissible in the culture of science. Part of what I've run into with education, along with Katie, my Bostonian friend, we took 7 different fields of neuroscience and psychology, and we condensed them all into one book that we wrote to the teenager, because we wanted to have a message. So we were like, let's skip the middleman or middle woman, and let's write straight to the kid.
What's the book?
It's called The Straight A Conspiracy. And the reason why we called it The Straight A Conspiracy is because we, at the time, were working with the son of a guy named Stan Rogo, who was the executive producer on Lizzie McGuire. Lizzie McGuire was Hilary Duff kids' TV show. In the 90s, it was super big. It was the Miley Cyrus of or early 2000s, I think. Mm-hmm. We were struggling with how do you have a conversation about education in school and your potential and all these sorts of things with kids. Our intuitions are the classic teacher intuitions. We sat down with Stan, and Stan said, listen, I've been making kids' TV for a long time. And if I've learned one thing about teenagers, it's this. Their lives suck. And so the only thing you can ever tell them that they will believe is that they've been lied to. So that's what we did. And he said, the title of your book is The Something Conspiracy. I don't know what it is. And so we went away and we did The Straight A Conspiracy. And rather than getting kids to believe in themselves, we got them to doubt their doubts. And once you got them doubting their doubts and all the things that they believed about math genes, is that really true? How do we know that, bro? Like, is that really, all that sort of stuff. Right. And then you get that process where they're now starting to question things. The first chapter is all about genius myths, which are very clever marketing schemes that rely on that thing of awe. So if you look at someone like Steve Jobs, Steve Jobs was a very smart marketer, and he created this image, this cult of personality around himself, which is that he made himself seem like this genius who out of nowhere came out of all these things. People called him the I God and the cult of Mac. And what is the effect of awe? The effect of awe is blind copying. We just had to have that Mac product. And in that, he was copying the playbook of another guy much, much earlier, Thomas Edison, who in his own time created this own cult of personality around himself. And at the time, he was known as the Wizard of Menlo Park. But in reality, did Edison invent the light bulb? No, he did not. The light bulb was around 45 years before he was even born.
Edison ripped off Tesla. That's what he did, that fuckhead. You watch Drunk History? Ever see Duncan Trussell's version of Drunk History? It's all on Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison being a cunt. It's amazing.
And that's the point, is that these people were people. And the myths that you have about geniuses are actually clever advertising schemes. But the problem is that it's an ad jingle that is so good that we've had that jingle trapped in our heads for hundreds and hundreds of years. So there are ideas that are passed on, like Edison had 1,000 patents to his name by the time he died. He did. That's because when you set up an industrial research lab, you make sure that your name is on all the patents, because that's the whole point of employing a bunch of people is that you want to own the IP. And that's true for Mozart, was the Michael Jackson of the 1700s. Isaac Newton, they knew that they couldn't sell the ideas of gravity, so they sold Newton as the man, this guy who had this great vision and blah, blah, blah. And then Einstein, they needed to package the new physics that was being done by lots and lots of physicists like Heisenberg and Planck and all that sort of stuff. But there was this guy, Arthur Eddington, who knew he couldn't sell that. So he sold the idea of a boy wonder with crazy hair who had beaten Newton and was displacing Newton. Now, the point is, you go and you talk to physicists and they'll tell you it's not really true. Like, Einstein didn't really displace Newton. We still use Newtonian mechanics. We only use Einsteinian mechanics when we start to get near the speed of light. So there are all these marketing schemes. But in the marketplace of ideas, part of what happens is that there are these big public intellectuals like Richard Dawkins. And they have a lot of power. And it becomes very difficult to challenge them. And in particular, I don't think that anybody particularly wants to go up against Richard Dawkins.
He's a sacred cow.
He is a sacred cow. And if you go up against the new atheists or you challenge anything about the new atheists, how does Sam Harris feel about God? Or how does Sam Harris feel about religion?
He doesn't believe in religion, and I don't think he necessarily believes in any form of a deity, because there's no evidence for that.
Let's look at, for example, your friends, the anarcho-capitalists and libertarians, who just want to get rid of government. Okay. And they're just trying to get rid of all government. What is that thinking about? What is that psychology about? Or Muslim fundamentalists, they just want to get rid of these Western influences. They basically think that a certain thing is bad, and they're constantly trying to strip it out. That's the nature of fundamentalism. And Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris are atheist fundamentalists. And specifically, Richard Dawkins has talked about militant atheism. And Richard Dawkins has said that religion is the scourge of humanity and that we need to get rid of religion. In reality, if you look at the scientific evidence, what you're going to find out is that religion has a very checkered past, that religion has, in terms of the history of violence, Steven Pinker has this book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, and he talks about the fact that what the new atheists are saying about religion is not supported by the evidence, that in history, religion has not been any one thing. It's had some good things, it's had some bad things. Okay. So that's not a scientifically appropriate belief to go around and saying that religion is the scourge of all humanity or to be waging war over religion. And particularly Dawkins, because he's the most militant of them. They taught the controversy around evolution. So they were like, well, there are 4 different theories of the origins of life. One is young Earth creationism. One is intelligent design. One is Earth as metaphorical day. And then the 4th one is evolutionism. Ultimately, what I want to do is I want to move these ideas. The whole point is that part of the reason why you brought me on this podcast today is specifically because I called out Richard Dawkins.
No. I brought you on because Bryan Callen recommends you, and I listened to you on his podcast.
Okay.
Had nothing to do with that. I just thought that'd be an interesting topic of discussion.
Okay. Ultimately, that's the larger thing that I would like to achieve is a scientific reformation. Martin Luther triggers this reformation with the Catholic Church and all of that sort of stuff. At the core of the Catholic Church was this idea of love thy neighbor as thyself. And basically, Martin Luther said the people in the power in the religious establishment are not living that principle. At the core of science is this idea that we should be responsive to evidence. And the scientific establishment is often not living, or the academic establishment is not living that principle. Part of the problem is that left to their own devices, they will continue to remain in their tiny lanes. And a lot of these academic disputes can only be solved by going outside their lanes. If Sam Harris was here, the one thing that I would want to talk about, the only thing that I would want to talk about is this rationalist versus intuitionist idea, and try and reach some sort of definitive conclusion on that. Because if Sam Harris's thinking and feeling are always being linked, then he has to decide how his feelings about religion are driving his thinking, and whether his feelings about religion are appropriate in light of the evidence, or whether they're not appropriate. What I'm saying is that if you want to move science, like science has a communication problem. Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins are the kind of friends, with friends like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, science doesn't need enemies. They are alienating, they are not helping us, and they're getting in the way of communicating science.
You feel the same way about Neil deGrasse Tyson and his open criticism of religion?
I think in general that I don't think that the criticism of religion is helping science. Science has been at war with religion for 150 years.
So you don't think that science should be honest, or that
I think
scientists should be honest about their own personal beliefs?
Well, but the point is that I believe that scientists should read science widely. And if you look at someone like John Haidt, part of the reason why John Haidt and Sam Harris have fought is because John Haidt doesn't have a problem with religion. Because when you update your view of the brain, you come to realize that what's really going on is that you blindly internalize the beliefs of science and your community and all that sort of stuff, and that they blindly internalize the beliefs of their community. And that if you want to move ideas, if you want to move scientific ideas, what we have to do is establish trust. It's this idea of that reason and emotion are separate. The main point is this, that from all of our conversations about culture, there are ideas out there trapped in books that have real practical value to improving people's lives. Those ideas are not moving.
Thank you very much, man.
Yeah,
really
thanks so
appreciate
much for having me on.
We'll do it again, man.
Yeah,
it seems like we've got a lot more to talk about.
There's a lot to
sure.
talk about.
All right, you fucks. See you tomorrow. Bye.